Welcome to the wonderful recap of Oz, where we explore L. Frank Baum's iconic book series and their countless film, television, stage, and literary adaptations. Sit back, put on your ruby slippers, or silver, whichever you prefer, and let's dive in. So, welcome to the podcast, Christopher.
Thank you.
So, for those of you who don't know, Christopher is an Oz book collector. In fact, that's his username on Instagram. And we met probably in the last month or so, just networking through the podcast. But could you talk a little bit more about your connection with Oz and how that started for you?
Yeah. So I grew up just wanting to be Judy Garland. That was
Don't
my
we all?
life's goal. Absolutely. I saw The Wizard of Oz when I was 2 and just fell in love ever since. And I was an Oz collector growing up. My grandmother was a wonderful proponent and still is of all of the Oz collectibles. And recently, my partner, my fiance, got me one of the Bradford Exchange facsimiles of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz with Mr. Robert Baum's signature. And it kind of launched me into collecting antique books or special illustrations of the Oz stories. And I've found this beautiful community that I've just felt so welcome and just loved meeting everybody.
Yeah, I felt the same way because when I started the podcast earlier this year, I had never thought of the existence of an Oz community. I was just so delighted with how many kind people there are and how they all sort of are looking to just preserve that legacy. I just thought that was really awesome.
Yeah.
So, the movie that we're going to be talking about today is Walt Disney's Return to Oz. Now, Christopher actually recorded a Return to Oz segment with Oz Talk. That's through the International Wizard of Oz Club. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. It was actually the impetus for me seeing Return to Oz for the first time.
Wait,
Um,
wait, wait. You you saw it for the first time this year?
yes. Yes. Okay,
Oh,
Justin,
I
because
didn't know that.
yes, because it's so ironic because growing up, I was obsessed with the 1939 MGM film, and my certain family members were like, "You don't need to watch Return to Oz. It's not as good as the first one." And so I just never did, partially because I think it's the whole thing that I think we'll speak to later in this episode of like the marketing and the way in which this film was framed as like a sequel to the 1939 film, and it's kind of different because it's not Judy is not in it, like it's not a musical.
Mhm.
And so when I saw it for the first time early this year, I was like, oh, okay, I've been missing out. There's like so much there, right?
Yeah, yeah. We're definitely gonna get into why it's so such an important Oz adaptation. But I first saw the movie when I was a kid. We had a local video store, and we probably went, I think, once a week to just return movies and exchange them for different ones. And that's where I had heard of Return to Oz for the first time, but I didn't have a specific interest in seeing it, even though I loved the 1939 movie. And of course, by looking at the cover, it did look in spirit like a sequel to the MGM movie, which just goes to show how mismarketed it is. But then eventually I found it online probably a few years later, and I watched it for the first time, and I really enjoyed it. I think it took me some time to separate it from its predecessor, and it was the first Oz movie aside from the 1939 movie that I had ever seen, and I really liked it. When I showed my family, they thought it was too scary.
It is spooky, and that's what my first reaction was like, oh my gosh, I'm like 26 years old, and I'm like kind of spooked by some of these like moments, like
Yeah, I think claymation can be very creepy, and there is a significant amount of that in this movie,
mhm.
and we'll get into it. I'm jumping ahead. So, Return to Oz was released in 1985, but it's important to note this is not the first time that the Walt Disney Corporation had intended to make an Oz film. Apparently, Walt Disney always wanted to make an animated film based in Oz, but MGM sort of beat him to the punch by making the live action adaptation, which was so well received. And it wasn't until the 1950s he actually purchased the rights to 11 of the Oz books. At this time, I think almost all of the 40, if not all the 40, were already published. But he purchased the rights to 11 of L. Frank Baum's Oz books on November 16th, 1954. And then 2 years later, he bought the rights to a 12th one. After that, he started working on a live action two-part TV special, which was supposed to be a vehicle for the Mouseketeers, for the Mickey Mouse Club. And then this ultimately just became too big of a project. So they then announced it as a big budget musical movie with a multi-million dollar budget. It was actually very highly anticipated. There were a lot of news releases about this, and they even premiered segments from the movie on the Disneyland 4th anniversary television special, which was broadcast on September 11th, 1957, and it featured 3 songs from the film. Those were, what is it? It was Patches, Oz Can Hop, and just the title song, Rainbow Road to Oz.
Yeah, it's so interesting how like the OzCan hop. I was like, this is so American. I know that the Wizard of Oz stories are like the American fairy tale, but it was just kind
Mhm.
of funny in that I was like, oh, we are from America with this OzCan hop.
Yeah, it also like kind of reminded me of like the golden age musicals, like Bye Bye Birdie, West Side Story, even like Babes on Broadway, just scenes that had a bunch of kids like in a gym or something just dancing,
Yeah.
and it doesn't really like have much of the plot. It's just more just like a fun number for the kids, and so I just thought that was kind of funny. The Rainbow Road to Oz. Now, this segment actually has been the footage does survive, and it is on YouTube for anyone who wants to watch it. It's about 11 or 12 minutes, and it features appearances from Scraps the Patchwork Girl, Scarecrow, Dorothy, and Princess Ozma, and those are the only ones that are coming to mind. I haven't actually watched that
The
in a while.
Cowardly Lion, right? He's like sitting in the background.
Oh, probably, yeah. Because I'm not sure if he was probably like either like an animatronic or a puppet or something like that. Now, the Cowardly Lion actually had a significant role in, or was supposed to have a significant role in this film, The Rainbow Road to Oz. It's known the plot was supposed to revolve around Dorothy and her cousin Zeb traveling to Oz, and people will recognize that subplot from the 4th Oz book. But they travel to Oz and find that Princess Ozma has been dethroned by the Cowardly Lion, who has fallen under an evil spell at the hands of the Wicked Witch of the West's son.
Which is always really interesting. Everybody wants the Wicked Witch to have a son. Because
Right.
in the original MGM script, there was like some like Miss Gulch and the Wicked Witch also had a son. There was this
Right.
weird subplot, right? So I think it's really interesting how everybody wants to get. I think it's to like give a vehicle for this like iconic villain to then have it survive,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I think I mean there are so many great villains in the Oz books, but the Witch of the West, the original Wicked Witch, is just so iconic, and I think a lot of people have latched onto specifically Margaret Hamilton's performance. I think when you think of Oz, you obviously associate her with that, so they want to have some sort of like connection or a son wanting revenge for his deceased mother or something like that. And I mean, I also haven't read Son of a Witch, which is the sequel to Wicked, but that also has the same premise of the Wicked Witch of the West's son. And also, I'm reading the summary of this plot and I'm like, where does any of this appear in in the Oz books? I mean, Disney purchased 12 of L. Frank Baum's Oz books and chose a plot that has nothing to do with any of them.
Don't you love it? They're like, we're just purchasing it to use like Dorothy in the Land of
Yeah, the
Oz. Like that's
characters,
it.
the set, yeah, whatever.
That's it.
Well, a screenplay for this movie was ultimately completed by producer Bill Walsh, and the latest one that I could find was dated on October 15th, 1957. This script was actually auctioned off a year or so ago. I found a listing for it on WorthPoint, so I do know that there was at least a complete script by then. But it's not entirely known exactly how much progress was made on this movie. There are some costumes and design sketches that survive. There are some original songs composed by the director Sid Miller with Tom Adair and Buddy Baker, but the film was ultimately shelved. Now, many people have stated that the reasons for this film not being made aren't entirely known, but there are rumors that Disney was just unhappy with the script or the material, or that he was just really concerned about the budget. But that's not the end of their attempts to try and make an Oz film, obviously. In a memo from February 16th, 1959, which was written by an animator at Disney named Ken Anderson, it suggested that Disney was trying to adapt Oz into an animated feature film. And he had even sent out a memo to all the animators in Disney to work on some of the designs for this feature. But this never materialized either.
It's always funny how these projects, and it's like so Hollywood and so like how these projects go so far and then they just like stop and we just like sometimes never know why, you know?
Yeah, because I don't think there was ever like a public statement regarding why the film was canceled. I know I don't remember how to pronounce her name. I think it was Annette Funicello. She was supposed to play Ozma in Rainbow Road to Oz. She was one of the Mouseketeers, and I think she corroborates the idea that Disney was just not happy with the material that was being made.
And Disney was a perfectionist, so
He certainly was.
I
And
believe it.
I this is also a project that he'd been wanting to do for literally decades. And if it wasn't, it doesn't surprise me that if it wasn't perfectly done, then he probably wouldn't want to pursue it that much.
What were your thoughts on what we saw in the Rainbow Road to Oz? That like segment, like what were your takeaways or feelings?
Well, it's hard for me to fully envision it, of course, because it's not actually clips from the movie. It's
Hmm.
just numbers that have been staged on simple soundstage. The sets are very minimal, but the costumes I really enjoyed. It's the first time, aside from the 1914 silent film, that we see the Patchwork Girl depicted in live action.
Hmm.
So that alone was really nice to see, and she and the Scarecrow have their little soft shoe number, which I thought was really cute, especially because when she's first introduced, there's this sort of insinuation there's this romantic subplot between Scraps and the Scarecrow. But then, of course, it ends with the cast walking on a giant birthday cake, which I presume, of course, is to celebrate Disneyland's fourth birthday.
Hmm.
But it just feels very strange. And there's pyrotechnics, and they're and they're singing "Up We Go, the Rainbow Road to Oz," but they're just on a cake. I think it's interesting, and I think from the other pictures I've seen of some of the graphic designs, they were also hoping to make like Disney World attractions based on this film, and sketches for those survive as well. And it really makes me wonder why we don't have more.
I know. It's like, come on, I would have killed to see this version of Oz. This version of Oz is like so funny because I think the MGM is like so polished to me and is
Hmm.
so like straight laced, if you will. I don't know.
Yeah.
And this is like so scrappy and fun, and I think more truer to these like kind of like fun characters.
Oh, for sure. It's so much fun to watch. And I would love to get my hands on that screenplay. I mean, if any of you who are listening have that screenplay or know who has it, let me know. I want to read it so badly. I want to know what this movie was going to be.
It's for research,
it's
guys. It's
it's
for
it's for
research.
research. It will not be public, I promise. Anyway, Disney ultimately shelves Oz and they don't touch it again until 1980. This is when Walter Murch approached Disney executive Tom Wilhite and said that he wanted to make an Oz movie. Now, Walter Murch was not known for writing or directing. He was known and is still known for his work in post production elements, sound, and editing. Some of his works before Return to Oz include The Godfather Part 2 and Apocalypse Now. Disney wanted to make movies that were similar to Star Wars and Black Stallion because they were recent hits, and I think Disney wanted to jump on that bandwagon. And so they were also looking for people who were associated with those films, and I think Murch was working on Black Stallion,
Hmm.
which is how he got his way into this executive meeting with Disney. And he had a fondness for the Oz books from his childhood. They were an important part of his mom's childhood. The Land of Oz was the first book he ever read on his own as a child. So there's a
So
lot of
sweet.
sentimental value there too.
Yeah.
And when he said that he wanted to make an Oz movie, Tom Wilhite sort of perked up because he knew that Disney owned the rights to the books still, and they hadn't done anything with it, but they wanted to make a movie because the books were about to go into the public domain. Or the rights were about to expire. It was one of those two things. But
Hmm.
regardless, he thought that would be a perfect project. So, and now would be the perfect time. So the film was greenlit in September 1981. From the get go, it was revealed or was stated it was going to be its own story, separate from the 1939 MGM musical, and Murch was set to direct, but he also co-wrote the screenplay with Gil Dennis, and they heavily focused on the books Marvelous Land of Oz and Ozma of Oz. Those are books 2 and 3.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. He was talking about the books that he was focusing on. He had to merge the two. He loved the second book, but Dorothy isn't in the second book, which I think is wild as a fan of Dorothy.
Yeah, when I read it, I was surprised by that too. But I know that I mean he definitely wrote the book with the Scarecrow, and the Tin Man in or the Tin Woodman in mind because they were just such a hit in the Broadway musical and in the touring production. So I think they were meant to be the sole returning characters.
And then all the kids were like, "What about Dorothy? What about
Right, they
Dorothy?"
want to know more about her.
Me.
And and of course then she is in all the rest of them.
Yeah.
But of course the second book does introduce us to Ozma for the first time.
Mhm.
It is very heavily based on the books, but it does include elements from the 1939 film, ultimately to tie the two of them together. Obviously, it's not at the forefront that it has those MGM connections, but Disney ultimately had to pay a fee to utilize the ruby slippers in this film. And another element that they may have borrowed was having the Kansas characters double as characters in Oz.
Mhm.
Walter Murch wanted to hire a young actress to play Dorothy, and he described the ideal candidate as someone who could be Judy Garland's cousin once removed. So ultimately, he cast Fairuza Balk, who would make her film debut as Dorothy in this film. She was officially cast in November 1983. She, of course, is well known for her role in The Craft, but she beat out several girls, including Juliette Lewis, Alanis Morissette, and Drew Barrymore. Apparently, they were also auditioning for the part.
Wild.
I can't imagine Alanis Morissette as Dorothy.
I truly can't either, and I also imagining Drew Barrymore kind of makes me giggle.
like ET era Drew Barrymore, just in Oz, having a great time.
Iconic.
And they do make her resemble Judy Garland in this film by giving her brunette hair that's in braids.
Mhm.
So that's another connection. Another young girl was cast as Princess Ozma, was Emma Ridley, and she is a London-based actress. She was born in London. She had a London accent, but Disney wanted Ozma to have an American accent. So Emma Ridley would go through the whole process filming her line or filming her scenes, and then all her lines were then dubbed over by Walter Murch's daughter Beatrice.
And the tea is that she didn't even know that was gonna
She
happen.
didn't know.
Poor girl. Like, oh my gosh, you go to the
That's
premiere.
I mean, can you imagine going to the movie and then watching the movie and going, "Do I sound like that?" And then being like,
No.
"No, that's not me."
Oh, that must have been so wild.
I know, and I know Emma Ridley. She didn't have a lot of additional acting credits outside of Return to Oz, and she still appears at a lot of conventions and dresses like Ozma. She has a dress that has been made for her as an adult to resemble it from the movie, and so she's a big hit with Oz conventions and with Oz fans, even though all her lines ended up being dubbed.
Yeah, I'm
Uh,
glad she still has a good relationship with the film.
yeah, yeah, and I think she looks upon it fondly. Of course, this is also I think the first film adaptation that features the Gnome King. Correct me if I'm wrong,
I think
or at
you're
least
right.
from your knowledge. Yeah, so the Gnome King is in this film. There were a few other actors who were considered for this role, including Tim Curry and Christopher Lloyd. Of course, these incredible character actors from the 80s, but ultimately Nicole Williamson was cast.
The thing that I
Yeah,
was like stunned when I heard about the Gnome King is that it took 5 hours to get
I
into
know.
makeup.
5 hours in makeup.
Brutal.
Yeah, that's hard. But when the mouse cuts you a check,
Take it
you'll
and run. Take it and
take it and
run.
take it and run. Now, another notable actress in this film is Piper Laurie, who I know as Margaret White from the 1977 film Carrie,
Hmm.
and she is cast as Aunt Em in this film. Now, Aunt Em in the books, Em and Henry are far more sympathetic and nurturing. It's strange to me how in like the MGM film and in this film, Em is sort of like frustrated, and she is ultimately the person that incites the action in this movie, I think,
Yeah,
because she's the one who leads Dorothy to danger
it's
unknowingly.
it's so interesting. I think both in the 1939 and in this one, Aunt Em can be driven so much by fear. I think she's like
Hmm.
scared that like Dorothy is like saying all these things that don't make
Right.
sense, and
Yeah, and it's not something that's going away. It's been how long has it been since they say it in the movie? How long has it
isn't
been
it
since the
3 months or
tornado?
something?
Yeah,
Or
it's only been like it's definitely been at least a few months, and she's still talking about it every day. And not only that, but Dorothy does mention some disturbing details about just Oz lore. And that's just super concerning to her. So it's interesting that the only two movies that I know Piper Laurie from, she's playing this stern maternal figure.
it's her type.
It's I guess so. Um, this film did suffer quite a few production woes, a few speed bumps. The first one that I want to take note of is in the fall of 1983, there was a change of management at Disney. So Richard Berger became the head of production and then ultimately stopped work on the film because he thought the budget for the movie was way too high, and he was not going to let the movie be made unless the screenplay was rewritten so a lower budget could be adhered to it.
Which is
Uh,
wild. I
yeah,
and like imagine having like gotten the green light literally on all these different elements. Merch said that he had already cast some of these roles, and
yeah,
it's like being told like no, you can't unless you cut a lot of stuff. It's like
yeah. And he ultimately said that the biggest change he had to make to his screenplay, he actually had to rewrite the screenplay in 10 days, and he excised a subplot featuring the Army of Oz. The Army of Oz, of course, does appear in the third Oz book, Ozma of Oz, and they actually travel to conquer the Gnome King with Ozma and Dorothy and all their companions. And he mentions he'd already cast the roles. He already had actors who were ready to play the Army of Oz, and then he had to get rid of them. He mentioned that he really liked the characters, but he ultimately came down to, can he tell the story without them?
and he could because we, didn't I didn't miss them,
No, neither did I.
but
But I wonder if it would have ultimately taken away from the story. I think the movie is, the scenes where they are with the Gnome King, I think are very well done, and they're
mhm,
very tense,
mhm.
but they're also very intimate, and I think that that Army of Oz would have taken that away.
Yeah, because we would have had more like wide shots and things that aren't as intimate.
Right, right. Plus a lot more guessing in the ornament room.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Ultimately, he does rewrite the screenplay. Disney is happy. Richard Berger is happy. So, principal photography does begin on February 20th, 1984, in England. But the film was almost canceled again before that. So, they wanted to film the majority of the movie on location. Like, they were looking at filming actually in Kansas. They were looking to film in a desert for the Deadly Desert, like a real desert in, I think he said the Sahara Desert or something
Yeah,
like that. Like, they were going to be traveling the world to film this movie. And then because of this change in management, the budget had to be restricted. So they ultimately had to film the entire thing in England. And most of the Oz scenes were filmed in, I think it's Elstree Studios.
yeah, which is the same place that Indiana Jones and Star Wars were filmed. I was like, "What? Like this is so like such a crossover."
I love that, honestly. And that studio's in London, is that right?
Yeah.
I think that's what I found.
Yep.
But of course, the Kansas scenes, you can't really. They had to find something that was essentially on location, but it had to resemble Kansas. And he mentions they had a really hard time finding Kansas in England. And they eventually found this location in Wiltshire, England, on a rolling plain that looked like it was the perfect site. And so all of the Kansas scenes were filmed there. And I mentioned that the film was almost shut down, and that's because it was ultimately coming down to, if you can't find a filming location for Kansas, we're not starting production on the movie.
And it's like came down to the day and they
Yeah,
still hadn't found it, but
yeah.
then
They
he
said you have
calls
24 hours to find the filming location.
and then he calls Richard Berger being like, "I found it." And he's like, "Okay, great." And he found it, but then they found it later that day. It's like, "Oh my gosh, I've been down to the wire on a creative project like that too where you're like, "Oh my god."
Yeah, and you're just really hoping that and praying that it just works out that way.
Yeah.
And this is also, I think, the first movie he's written and directed. Maybe the only movie he's written and directed. I can't imagine the stress of that.
Yeah, he had said that like he was just constantly like waiting for something to go wrong or like imagining something is going to go wrong. It's like,
Yeah,
"Oh god."
yeah, and things did go wrong. Well, there were a lot of interruptions, but we'll get there. So this movie ultimately was given a $20 million budget. That was their limit, but that would increase to 28 because the movie was so ambitious. There were production delays, and they also combined a lot of different styles of effects. They had practical effects, animatronics, and stop motion clay animation, just to name a few. Walter Murch actually teamed up with the legendary Brian Henson, son of Jim Henson, and of course, I'm not sure if he was chairman at the time, but of course, chairman of the Jim Henson Company. So Brian Henson ended up portraying Jack Pumpkinhead in this movie. And because of that connection, there were several, Multimerch calls them the Muppeteers on set, and they were people who had worked on Sesame Street and other Muppet media. This is another Muppet connection to Oz. There's a lot of Muppet connections to Oz. I'll be covering that next week, so stay tuned. But Jack Pumpkinhead was portrayed by both a puppet and a man in a suit. Now, I think the man in the suit was for like the wide shots or things like that, and then the puppet was for all the close-ups.
Mhm.
They had to work a lot with the actor who was in the suit to make sure that he was resembling the puppet, because he was walking, I think they said he was walking too stiff,
Mhm.
and then but the puppet had more of a freer motion, so they had to copy those patterns. And on top of that, the lion's head was completely animatronic. It was radio controlled, but the body was just a man in a suit. Tick-tock was entirely radio controlled almost, except his legs. And the videos of this are insane.
This poor
Uh
man.
yeah, you can find behind the scenes footage of Return to Oz online. And so the puppeteer who was ultimately in the tick-tock costume, he was doubled over with his arms crossed. He was strapped in to keep him in that position because tick-tock isn't a full body suit. It's essentially just a circle with legs. There was a tiny TV monitor in the suit that helped him see where he was going, and he had to control the legs. But the suit also had to be opened every 2 minutes because there was no ventilation in the suit.
Guys, we need him to breathe.
That's
That's wild. That is so wild.
and you see the videos of them like opening the body up in the suit, and you just see him balled up, and they have to unstrap him so he can stand up and breathe, and like
Mhm.
stretch a little bit before he has to go right back into it. And I mean, the stuff that he does in this movie is very impressive. TikTok is a very active character. So they also, of course, had Belina in this film. Belina appears in the third Oz book as well. Belina is a chicken. A chicken is very familiar to the general public. So when they had to recreate her, at least her animatronic close-up scenes, they had the most difficulty with that because it would be very obvious if it wasn't a real chicken. But Belina was also doubled with live chicken, right?
Yeah, real
Uh, there were
chicken
there
for the wide
there were a
shot.
few chickens in the long shots, and I think Fairuza Balk looked back fondly on just working with the chickens on set.
Can you imagine just like getting to play with chickens all day?
And that's your job. You're shipped out to London. You're playing with chickens. You're getting to pal around with Disney executives and Muppeteers.
Yeah, what a crazy environment to grow up in. And I think I remember
Right.
Emma Ridley and Fairuza Balk talking about how they would just like run all over set and the sequins and like things on the ruby slippers would be like constantly falling off. And so they would have to take them off as soon as they were done shooting. Otherwise, they would be like busted for the next take. It's like so cute.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear that they were able to have some playtime on set as well,
Hmm.
because they were young. I can't remember, they were like 11 or 12 or something like that. Like they were
I think Fairuza was
kids.
10.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
And to
And
be, and of
carries
course,
this movie, carries the movie
she
so
yeah,
good.
she's in every scene, essentially revolves around her performance, and I think it's so good.
Hmm.
And then, of course, in terms of the special effects, Pons Mar was the person hired to be in charge of the character movement, supervising movement, but he also was in the film. He played the head wheeler. And the wheelers are essentially just men on wheeled stilts
Uh
on their
huh.
arms and legs. I can't imagine like
Rehearsal.
rehears-
Rehearsal
rehearsing
guy. I
rehearsing
just
on wheels.
oh my gosh. It looked hard and looked physically taxing. Like
Yeah.
physical therapists got to be on call real quick.
Yeah, it's incredible and it's also terrifying.
Yeah.
But the stuff that they did for this movie are just, I'm in awe over it. And it looks really good. Of course, I prefer practical effects over CGI any day.
Hmm.
And with the film aging over the years and just the certain aspects that have become dated, it just becomes way more endearing. I think it's another reason why it's such a cult classic today.
Yeah, like Star Wars, and that there are certain things if you watch older versions of Star Wars that are like, haha, that's funny. But also, it's like that was like groundbreaking, like at that
Right.
time.
Yeah. People are in the theater losing their minds
Yeah.
at what they were seeing. Here's when we get to a really big road bump in the making of this movie. 5 weeks in, Disney was expressing, the company was expressing that they were pretty dissatisfied with the footage, and they were also running behind schedule. They were starting to doubt Murch's ability of handling a movie of this caliber, And around the same time, the assistant director quit, and then Disney fired Walter Murch. So he was fired for a week, and in the span of that week, two extremely well known filmmakers came to his defense and personally vouched for him, and that is George Lucas.
Like, what? My mind was so blown. I was like, George
Right.
Lucas is
Like
involved in
Star
this?
Wars, Indiana Jones, just it's wild to me. And also Francis Ford Coppola.
Insane.
So George Lucas ends up like making a deal with the studio. He's trying to barter with them to convince them to put him back on the film. George Lucas ultimately says Walter Murch is the only person that can do this. You would be mistaken if you didn't keep him on. And I am so confident in his ability to do this film that if there is any further issue down the line, you can call me and I'll replace him. I'm willing to take the time to finish it if you think that he can't handle it.
And it's like really interesting because, you know, with someone like George Lucas, the studio must have
Mhm.
felt the security of like, you know, okay.
Yeah, Walter Murch said that once the studio heard that, it was sort of like they sighed and like, all right, sure, Murch can come back
Hmm.
because apparently that was all they needed to hear was George Lucas saying, "I'll be your safety net.
Hmm.
Just trust him, and if I'm wrong, I'll do the movie."
And he's a pretty good safety net. Like,
He is a. I
come
mean,
on.
I would love to have George Lucas in my corner.
For sure.
So after a week of this fighting back, Murch was then reinstated. But additional budget cuts and production delays forced the reducing of the roles of the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, and the Cowardly Lion. Their costumes and animatronics had to be simplified. Even Jack Pumpkinhead was supposed to have a fully animatronic face, and it is still sort of animatronic, but not as much as they wanted it to be. And it was also extremely hot on set. Fairuza Balk actually fainted on set once due to heat stress. It was just a grueling 8 months of filming. They filmed it over 8 months in London and in Wiltshire, and then production wrapped in October.
A wild journey. These like big movies. It's so interesting that they also had like a director shuffle, like at the 1939, like the creative, the producer.
Oh yeah,
You know, it's funny how that all just kind of mirrors
yeah,
the original.
yeah. The parallels are just fascinating.
Yeah,
So, should we get into the movie? Is it time to get into the recap part of the wonderful recap of Oz?
sure. I'm down.
All right. It's been 6 months since the tornado hit Kansas. Dorothy is laying in her bed and she's looking out the window and she can't sleep. So Aunt Em goes in to see her and she's very concerned. And Uncle Henry he's in the middle of building a new farmhouse since theirs is, well, gone. They're still trying to get back on their feet. It's approaching winter and the house is only half done.
It's like the stress of like real world grown up things are suddenly like, you know, we can't deal with your like Oz things, your Oz
Right.
talk.
Exemplary in the next day. Now, of course, when Dorothy's in bed, she does see a shooting star in the distance. Then the next morning, she finds in the yard, well, actually, Belina, the farm hen,
Hmm.
finds a key. And it's this old looking key, and it looks like it has the letters OZ on the head. Dorothy immediately sees this as proof. This is from Oz. You know, she goes to Aunt Em and she's like, it's probably from the old house. And then Dorothy tries to be more insistent about it, but Aunt Em is just not having it. And she's trying to remind Dorothy that Oz is something she made up in her head and it's not real.
Yeah, and it's also sad like Dorothy's like hearing Uncle Henry and Aunt Em kind of talk about what to do with her. You know, she's like
Right.
lying in bed that night.
Right. She keeps talking about it. It's getting to be a problem and poor Dorothy is just
Seriously.
listening in. Things are not good at the Gale farm. But when she finds the key, it's sort of like the last straw for Aunt Em. She says, "Okay, I'm going to take her to a psychiatric hospital and we're going to have someone examine her because she can't sleep anymore and she's talking about Oz all the time. We need to get her some help."
Hmm.
So they travel to see Dr. Worley. And the scene starts with her telling Dr. Worley about how the Tin Woodman became a Tin Man.
Which is a very disturbing or like a little darker story, right?
Yes, it's not in the MGM movie, but here she goes right out of the gate saying, "The Tin Woodman was my friend. The Wicked Witch enchanted his axe, which chopped off all his body parts, so he had to be replaced with a completely tin body." And Dr. Worley's like, "Oh, okay, yeah," and so, like, "Oh, okay, gotcha." And then that's when he is talking to Aunt Em and says, "All right, I have the perfect device." He just brings out this machine and he just says that the machine is just gonna get rid of all of her memories of Oz. And he doesn't exactly explain to Dorothy what it is. Instead, he like disarms her by pointing out that it looks like the machine has like a face, which of
Hmm.
course comes in later. But Aunt Em knows what it is. And Aunt Em, of course, has to leave Dorothy behind. And you can tell that she's nervous about
Hmm.
her decision. Dorothy is kindly escorted to her own room. While she's in her room, this girl shows up. Pretty blonde girl in like a white dress. This girl with no name just gives her a little pumpkin.
It's Halloween time.
It's Halloween time. It's October in 1899. That's when this movie takes place. Because they're also talking about it's going to be the turn of the century soon.
Hmm.
The girl then disappears because Dorothy hears like a noise that sounds like a scream in the distance. And then when she turns around, the girl's gone, which is straight out of a horror film.
Yes, Dorothy's been through enough. Why we gotta scare her, Ozma?
Right. But you know Dorothy, you've read the books.
Oh yes, Dorothy's
Dorothy literally
strong.
like in the third book, she's thrown from a ship into the ocean while on a journey to Australia. She just gets in a chicken coop and is like, "Well, I guess I'm going on an adventure." There's no sorts of like, "I'm gonna die." There's none of
Right.
that. She's just like, "Oh, I all right, cool.
And also
Stuff's
no
going on."
sadness, like, no sadness of, like, "Oh, that's so sad that, like, Uncle Henry's gonna be looking right." It's just like, "Okay, here we go, like, this is
Yeah.
where we're going."
I'm just a kid.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of things that this movie does well in terms of adaptation, and one of them is maintaining that innocence of Dorothy and her genuinity. Like
Mhm.
there are lines that she says in this movie that feel like they're taken from the book. Like some of her responses to certain things, and it's like that sounds like what Dorothy would say.
Absolutely. Fairuza also does such a beautiful job of embodying her, like, kind of doe-eyed curiousness
Yeah.
that I think book Dorothy, like, is just all about.
Well, Walter Murch was talking about how what ultimately won Fairuza Balk the role was her imagination,
Mhm.
and how she had this sense of wonder that wasn't in the other candidates, and she just won the role.
Mhm.
Yeah, she does an incredible job. So Dorothy's alone in her cell,
Basically.
essentially, and then the nurse comes by, and the nurse coaxes her onto this a gurney, I guess, and they strap her down, and they wheel her down to this little operating room. And just before he hits the button to give Dorothy electroshock therapy, a storm knocks out the power.
All these storms always coming in clutch, like, right at the right
Always
time.
always coming in to first off bring Dorothy, I guess, out of danger. Here, it rescues her from electroshock therapy.
Yeah.
It's such a dark
It
storyline.
was
I
so
I want to know where this came from because this is not in the books.
no. And so when I was first watching this, I was like, "Whoa!" It's just like spooky, and the sound of like shocks, and also like the idea of it is just like so interesting.
Plus, like the screams in the background.
Yeah.
It's just scary.
Hmm.
So the power has been knocked out. The doctor and the nurse leave Dorothy alone, strapped down in the dark, and they go to check the generator. Now Dorothy can hear even more screaming.
And who comes to her rescue?
But this mysterious unnamed blonde girl who
Yes.
gave her the pumpkin, and she
Pumpkin Girl.
takes the pumpkin girl, pumpkin girl, and pumpkin girl helps her get off the table, and they just start running.
Hmm.
This girl's trying to get Dorothy out. Ultimately, the nurse finds them. The nurse sees them trying to leave, and they succeed in running out of the hospital, and they end up like running down to a river or a stream or a creek, whatever. But now it's like a rapid because it's a severe storm, and the two of them, who falls in? One of them falls in, and then the other one jumps in after them.
I
I
can't
think,
remember
I
either.
think, I think Pumpkin Girl falls in,
Yes,
and
yes.
then and Dorothy tries to help her, and then the nurse starts approaching, so she jumps in the water too.
Yes, and also really interesting that Fairuza was like, I do my own stunts. Like I did all my stunts as she's like 10 years old. And I was like,
She said, "Oh yeah,
okay,
I do my own
girl.
stunts. Yeah, I got in a pool in a tank, and I just flailed around for a little bit. I do my own stunts.
Get it, girl.
Good for her."
Yeah.
Pumpkin Girl and Dorothy are in the river. Dorothy then loses sight of this blonde girl. We do not see this character, this specific character, again for the rest of the movie. But Dorothy then finds a chicken coop that's just floating down the water. So she gets in and she seeks refuge in that.
I love these chicken coops. Just there for us when we need it, you know?
A conveniently placed chicken coop.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Karen.
And I'm Colleen.
And this is Books
Movies?
and Musicals.
Oh my! Come join us as we discuss our favorite childhood stories in analytical and honest ways.
Most recently, we've been discussing Harry Potter and Disney princesses.
We have so many more ideas and we can't wait to go through them with you.
So, keep it magical.
And leave a little magic wherever you go. Bye!
Do you want to escape over the rainbow all the time? Ah, we see you nodding. If so, I'm Tara.
And I'm MK. And we are so happy to welcome you to Down the Yellow Brick Pod, a neighbor podcast of the wonderful recap of Oz that falls down many fascinating ruby red rabbit holes as we preserve and peel back the curtain on the wonderful world we all know.
Or thought we knew.
And love.
Think if NPR's On Being, Fresh Air, and Tiny Desk Concerts suddenly collided and were given an Oz twist? That's totally our vibe.
Down the Yellow Brick Pod is available wherever you listen to podcasts, along with a Technicolor scrapbook on Instagram at Down the Yellow Brick Pod.
For a more intimate community experience with bonus content, virtual hangs, and monthly musical Oz coffee shop covers, come check out our membership tiers on patreon.com/Down the Yellow Brick Pod. For some Good Witch Trouble swag, shop our merch at etsy.com/shop/downtheyybp.
On behalf of all independent podcasters and artists, we thank you for listening and know these Ozian podcasts always value your support. Here's to celebrating the things that connect us and the things we love.
I want to give a shout out to my incredible Oz Recap patrons. I can't thank you enough for your kindness. Podcasting is really hard work, and it's so reassuring to have supporters like you. Our little wizards are Leslie Carnahan and Tara Tagliaferro, and we have quite the royal army consisting of Gothic Gargoyle, Tyler Varney, Jay, JRL Studios, and the OzConnection. Not only do patrons assist in providing quality content, they are also entitled to exclusive bonus content not available anywhere else. That could include exclusive podcast episodes, behind-the-scenes videos, commentary tracks, and more. To become a patron, visit patreon.com/OzRecap. The next morning, the sun is out and she wakes up and she's in this little pond. And then she realizes that she's not alone in the chicken coop. It's not Pumpkin Girl, it's Belina. It's her chicken from the Kansas farm that just somehow appeared in the chicken coop with her.
Love that. We love that.
Also, Belina starts talking in perfect English.
And she's like, oh, we can't be in Kansas. Belina, you're talking.
Right, like the only place I know animals can talk is Oz. And then she sort of looks around and she notices like the water disappears from under her. She realizes she's in the middle of a desert and she goes, oh wait, no, this must be Oz because this is the deadly desert.
We must be over the rainbow.
We must be over the rainbow. And instead of Toto, she's got her chicken.
Yes.
And yes, Toto is also in this movie. He just is not in Oz with Dorothy.
Right.
we see him in Kansas, and he plays an important part later. But Toto is replaced ultimately in Oz with Belina, who can talk, and Toto cannot in this film universe, I
Yeah,
guess.
Toto was busy. He was filming another movie, so
Yeah,
he wasn't
busy.
available.
Budget cuts forced the reducing of the role of Toto.
Unfortunately.
So luckily there are some conveniently placed rocks so that she can jump out of the chicken coop and jump from rock to rock without touching the sands, because what happens when you touch the sands?
Turn to dust, baby.
You turn to dust. Gone. You die instantly. Instant death. Dorothy brings Belina to safety. They find this grassy part, and it's filled with trees that have these lunch pails growing on them. This is an element from the books.
Mhm.
And so she says, oh, okay. And she just picks a lunch pail up and just starts eating. Meanwhile, a face appears in one of the rocks she just stepped on, and then, like, looks grumpy.
Yes, it's like,
the rock is
ow.
not happy. And then and then it just kind of disappears. And
Foreshadowing of the
yes, it's foreshadowing.
scary villain.
And there's also this cut to inside this, like, cavern, and the face
Mhm.
appears and says, Dorothy's returned, but she has a chicken with her. And this disembodied voice goes, a chicken? Which is I think one of the funniest parts of the movie for me.
We do not stand chickens in Oz, guys.
At least not this disembodied voice.
Yes, true.
So Dorothy enjoys her lunch pail that she picked from a tree, and she decides, all right, I'm gonna journey into Oz and find my old friends. And then she is walking through the woods, and she's confused. She's like, where's Munchkinland? And then she comes across her old farmhouse, which is still there and still in ruin.
Nobody thought to move that. Nobody thought, let's clean it up.
I mean, technically it is the resting place of the Wicked Witch of the East.
True.
And
And,
despite how terrible she was, she does deserve a memorial.
True.
She does deserve to not have her resting place disturbed.
The Munchkinland Historical Society said you cannot move this.
Right. Or maybe they're scared to move it in the hopes that she's still alive under there.
Oh, true. They're like, nope, you're staying down there.
Right. No, we're not moving that. Or it could even be like, they could have even, like, used it as a shrine to Dorothy, or I don't know, their heroine.
True.
Regardless, the house is still there, but there's no other signs of Munchkinland except the remains of the yellow brick road, which is so sad. Like, the bricks are pulled out and it's broken, and Dorothy immediately starts running down this road, and she reaches the Emerald City in about 30 seconds.
Literally.
Now that's not how it goes in the books at all, or in the MGM film. She just appears in the Emerald City really quickly.
Yeah, we just
and
had
she
to cut
finds
part of the script. In order
Yeah,
to get
yeah,
there.
budget cuts.
Yeah.
Budget cuts. And so she comes across the Emerald City, which is bare. The emeralds have all been stolen. It's been destroyed. It's decayed, and it's covered in vines. And she finds all the people that live there have been turned to stone, including her good friends, the Tin Woodman and the Cowardly Lion. She does, however, notice that there is no sign of the Scarecrow. She also finds a ring of dancing girls, but they are missing their heads.
Foreshadowing.
While she's trying to figure out what's going on, she gets pursued by the Wheelers.
Who are so spooky. The
so
sound
scary.
that they make, too.
In this summary, it describes the Wheelers as psychotic creatures with wheels.
Yes.
Psychotic creatures with wheels. And I mean, they're not wrong, but they're terrifying.
Mhm.
There are, I think, 3 scenes in this movie that are, like, genuinely scary, like, terrifying, and this is one of them.
Yes.
When these creatures with wheels on their hands and feet appear and start chasing Dorothy down, like, a dark alleyway.
Absolutely not.
No, I hate it. Don't like it. Belina, nope. I was skipping ahead. When they're in that, when they're in,
Lena, nope,
no, Lena, nope, no, not her,
no,
not
Belina,
yet,
no,
not yet. Belina, you're gonna wait. So they run down this alleyway and they find it's a locked door with a keyhole, and Belina goes, the key that you found in Kansas, and that's the key that opens up this door. And so Dorothy runs in and shuts the door behind her, and so the Wheelers can't get to her, so she's safe. She turns around and she finds our good friend tick-tock, the mechanical man that's guaranteed to work for 1,000 years. It can do anything but live. So she immediately reads his instructions, she winds up his thinking, speech, and action, and tick-tock explains that the Scarecrow had hidden him there and told him to wait for Dorothy.
What a smart idea.
I know. And so now we know that this key was sent to Dorothy by the Scarecrow. And he was hoping that she would come back to Oz and find tick-tock. Can you imagine if they didn't find it?
Just like tick-tock's like chilling in the room
Right.
forever.
Or if she came back to Oz and she accidentally left the key on her nightstand.
She was like, oh man, I put the pumpkin down and then I picked up the key and then the pumpkin girl, I just forgot it.
She went, oh, Pumpkin Girl stole it.
Yeah, where's Pumpkin Girl?
So she ends up having to enlist tick-tock as help. He has this badge that says he is the Royal Army of Oz, just him and no one else.
Mm-hmm.
And he then essentially beats the crap out of all the Wheelers. He is able to scare them all away, and he grabs hold of the head Wheeler, as portrayed by Pons Mar, and says, bring us to Mombi. And now Mombi, of course, is now referred to as Princess Mombi, supposedly in charge of the Emerald City or this part of Oz, and she may be the only one who knows where the Scarecrow is. The Wheeler reluctantly leads them to Mombi's castle, I guess, which I think is the Emerald City Hall,
Right.
which is now what she's turned into her palace. And Dorothy and tick-tock go in, and they find this beautiful woman just sitting alone and playing a lyre, a mandolin, just a stringed instrument, we'll say.
Right.
And in this gorgeous room full of mirrors. The set for this scene is incredible.
So incredible. And it's
so
ironic
gorgeous
because it wasn't even the original shooting location. They were going to shoot in this like actual like huge palace.
Right, and they had to come up with this, and honestly, it's still stunning.
Yeah, I think it's incredible.
Dorothy asks questions about what happened in the Emerald City, and Mombi's like, I think you should come with me.
I love
Like,
how
I'll tell.
I love how Dorothy's like so direct. She's like, "What happened to Oz?" It's just like she is just like so youthful and just like bold and brave that she's going to ask this like big stranger, like, "What happened?"
I know. It's no, hi, how are you? Who are you? It's what happened.
Literally.
Mombi then goes, come with me. I'll talk to you about it. And so he then brings Dorothy into this hall of cabinets. Now, tick-tock and Bellina stay behind, but Mombi takes Dorothy into this hall. And there's a bunch of locked cabinets, and on the inside are just a bunch of heads, women's heads. And she just very casually opens up one of the cabinets, picks up her own head, puts it down, closes the door, opens up another cabinet, and puts her own head on. Or a different head on.
Woof.
Scary.
Yeah, spooky as a visual, because in the books, I feel like it wasn't as scary.
Not really, but also with the books, the illustration, there's only really one illustration, and it's obviously a drawing. Here, you're seeing it on a person, and it's just like, ugh. Plus, we get to a scene later on, which is even creepier regarding these heads. Anyway, Mombi has now switched heads. She slipped into something more comfortable.
Just like gotta get into the right headspace,
My God! Not the right headspace. Eventually, she talks to Dorothy that the Gnome King has conquered Emerald City. That he took all the emeralds, kidnapped the Scarecrow, and took everything to his gnome kingdom. And then turned everything else into stone, leaving Mombi alone to essentially live by herself in isolation in the Emerald City. And then she looks at Dorothy and goes, you're beautiful, but you're not old enough yet. I want to keep you here because I want your head. And Dorothy is like, you absolutely will not have my head. And then Mombi captures Dorothy. tick-tock tries to come to her defense, but his action runs down, so he can't actually move. He's just kind of stuck there. Bellina flies towards Mombi, but Mombi grabs the chicken, and so brings her up to the tower and locks him in.
We gotta get tick-tock a longer battery life.
Well, to be fair, his action had run down quicker because of his fight with the Wheelers.
True.
So they're stuck in the tower. This is when Dorothy comes across Jack Pumpkinhead. She hears this voice going, Mom? Is that you, Mom? And she goes, "I'm not your mom, but it's nice to meet you." And, made of tree branches and sticks. And he he talks about where Mombi got all of her heads. He also talks about how he came to life, and that's from the powder of life, which Mombi just happens to have. And she keeps it in the cabinet with her original head. No big deal. And Dorothy goes, "Okay, I will just go get the powder when Mombi's asleep, and I will figure something out from there." Mombi falls asleep, and Jack just reaches through the door and just unlocks it. Like, this whole time he can just unlock the tower, but he just hasn't.
He's been like, I don't really know where else to go, Mom.
Right. Right. I have a home here. So he unlocks the door, and then basically Dorothy grabs tick-tock. She winds up tick-tock, sends Jack upstairs with tick-tock, and the two of them plus Belina start building this flying machine, this thing, this very scrappy device with 2 sofas and the head of a creature called a gump and palm tree leaves for wings. This is also now we're getting to scariest movie scene number 2.
Yes.
She goes up to the headless Mombi, because apparently Mombi sleeps without her hat on.
I know. She's like, I don't really need it, so I'm just
I don't
gonna
need it.
just take it off.
But of course, her key is attached to a ribbon on her wrist. So she quickly just snags the key and goes to the cabinet and opens up the cabinet that has Mombi's original head, cabinet 31. And she goes to grab the powder of life, but she knocks something else over, and the head wakes up. The head calls her name, and then all of the heads in the hallway wake up and start screaming. And then at the same time, headless Mombi on the bed wakes up.
And just is
starts
pawing around. It's just look at it, she's swimming.
Yeah. The classic zombie move of just standing upright with your arms outstretched.
Yes.
But with this time without a head. And so Dorothy quickly evades headless Mombi, runs up to the tower, and she successfully has the powder of life. Mombi puts her head on and tries to go and stop Dorothy and her friends, but in the nick of time, they get this flying machine to work. They bring him to life. The Gump is now a living thing, a living sofa, and they fly out the window over the Emerald City and towards the Gnome Kingdom. The Wheelers try to chase them on the ground. They ultimately go to the Deadly Desert. A bunch of Wheelers then fall on the sands, and they immediately turn to dust. Now, this is jarring to me because even in the books, I know that the sands do turn you into dust in the books, but in the books, we've never actually heard of any of the characters hit the sand and actually die.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first time in any Oz adaptation that actually shows the Deadly Desert killing someone.
Mm-hmm.
They claim several Wheelers. It's terrifying.
And all the other Wheelers are like, oh no, and they're all run back.
I love the Wheelers because they also make animal sounds.
It's like they're a pack of wolves.
Yeah, a pack of hyenas or wolves or something like that. It's so funny. But anyway, they have to go back to Mombi and say she flew over the Deadly Desert. They got away, and basically she makes the Wheelers pull her on a chariot, and she starts traveling to the Gnome Kingdom herself.
Which is so funny. It's very reminiscent of Ozma going on the chariot in the third one, right?
Yeah, in the third one. That's how she enters in the third one. That's how she and Dorothy meet. And then she's using she's using them as sled dogs and whipping them, and they're just running.
Very reminiscent of
wheeling.
Of what's it called? The White Queen in Narnia is come on, let's go.
The White Witch.
The White Witch, yes.
The White Witch. A night passes. They're in the sky for a while before they end up crash landing. The Gump starts to fall apart because, of course, he was very haphazardly made, and they all sort of crash conveniently on the Gnome King's mountain. Belina decides to hide in Jack's head because I think as Jack's head was falling off, she just sort of got in the head and was just stuck there, and she just never leaves.
It's warm in here.
And this is when the Gnome King finally appears. Dorothy confronts him and says that she's there basically to defeat him, and he just sort of laughs, and then the ground opens and swallows them all. There's just like Alice on the Rabbit Hole, as this summary does explain, she just sort of falls through all these precious gems and these the Northern Lights, this gorgeous journey she's going on, but she lands safely on the Scarecrow, and the Scarecrow then disappears in front of her. And I remember when I first saw this, of course, I didn't know if this was supposed to be like a sequel to the MJ movie or not, but Scarecrow looks very different, of course, than in the
Ray Bolger.
than Ray Bolger. And he also doesn't have a face that moves.
Uh-huh.
And I was just like, that's all you could do? I was disappointed.
Uh-huh.
And then also he was only there for a second, so I was like, I didn't even get like a good look at him.
Yeah, Scarecrow definitely, I mean, as we talked about earlier, that like his part was reduced. And so it's an interesting thing to have that expectation as it was like a younger person too. Yeah.
Yeah. Dorothy immediately goes, where did he go? The Gnome King appears in this wall in the cave and starts talking to Dorothy and says, oh, I turned him into an ornament in my room of ornaments. He's now a tchotchke in my collection.
It's funny that like he's like, yeah, Gnome King is like, yeah, he's an ornament and he's a tchotchke. And Dorothy's like, I know you were reducing his part a little bit, but like he's just like an ornament, just a fixture. Come on.
Right? Like, he's the king. The wizard left him in charge, and now he's just an ornament now?
Yeah.
They talk about these decorative things that he has, and he talks about how all the precious stones are his because he and his gnomes made them. So all the emeralds in the Emerald City were his, and the Scarecrow was the one who stole them from him. Because he thinks, since the Scarecrow was the king at the time of this conquer, he thought that the Scarecrow was the one who stole all of the precious stones. Dorothy kind of argues this and demands that the Gnome King free the Scarecrow, and he goes, all right, I'll free them, but you have to play a game first. You have to play my guessing game in the ornament room. You have to place your hand on an object that you think might be your friend and just say Oz. And if it's him, he comes back. And if it's not, you have 3 guesses. And if you get all 3 of them wrong, then you become an ornament too. After this, he treats her to like limestone pie and hot melted silver. Like, he feeds her. He's very nice to her. I've always loved how the Gnome King is, even how he's written. He's like kind of jolly. He's not mean when you meet him. It's not until he doesn't get what he wants that you find out how mean he really is. He's just like, oh yeah, I'm accommodating. You can stay here in the cavern for the night. I'll feed you.
Yeah, he's like kind of like evil Santa. You know, like he's just kind of like, oh, I'm like, come on in, have some cider, you know, like,
right.
and then, or I'll
Right.
turn you into an ornament if you don't do it right.
Evil Santa. Well, okay, so Evil Santa.
Oh no, where's Pumpkin Girl?
Evil Santa and Pumpkin Girl.
So good.
But the Gump is the first creature to start guessing, because all of Dorothy's friends get to guess. The Gump goes, he guesses wrong 3 times, and he's turned into an ornament. Dorothy's like, I don't want to play anymore. And the Gnome King's like, okay, then you can go to my fiery furnace. I don't care. You want to play the game? Let's play the game.
Mm-hmm.
Dorothy's like, fine. So Jack goes next, and same thing happens to him. And they keep going until tick-tock goes in. And when tick-tock goes in, the Gnome King reveals that he has her ruby slippers.
They fit him?
They apparently they fit his huge stone feet.
Uh-huh.
And
They are
you know,
magic.
they look, I mean, I guess so, but they do look really good on him, I will
Yeah.
say. Of course, at this point also, every single person that turns into an ornament, the Gnome King becomes more human-like. And he changes from just an appearance in the rock wall to just, now he's on a throne sitting, but he's still made of stone. And with every person that becomes an ornament, he just becomes more evil Santa.
Mm-hmm.
He reveals that he found the slippers after Dorothy went home. Now he wears them. The shoe's magic powers is what helped him conquer the Emerald City. And they're his ruby slippers because, again, the whole thing with the precious stones, they're his rubies, so they are his shoes. So Dorothy starts to think, oh god, this is partly my fault. Like, I should have held tightly inside of my shoes, like Linda told me to,
Mm-hmm.
or else none of this would have happened. While they're having this exchange, a messenger appears and tells the Gnome King that tick-tock has just stopped moving in the...
TikTok, you got one job.
tick-tock has just stopped moving. And so the Gnome King says, Dorothy, go and wind him back up, run his action up, and then you're the last person left. After tick-tock makes his final guess, you can just stay in there and you can just start guessing. He also gives her the opportunity to just go right home. He says, you don't have to do this. You don't have to be an ornament. I can take care of Oz, and I can use these shoes to send you back home. And she goes, no.
So
No, I'm going to save my
manipulative.
friends. Oh, he's horrible.
Yeah.
He seems so nice at times, but he's so manipulative, so evil. Of course, Dorothy is very headstrong. She goes right in and she finds tick-tock, and tick-tock goes, "Psst, I'm not actually run down. I just want you to be in here so if I guess wrong and I turn into an ornament, you can see what I turn into, and I can give you a clue." So she goes, "Okay, great idea." So she pretends to wind him up. He goes, he makes his guess, but he disappears too quickly, and the lights go out at the same time, and the lights come back up. She can't tell. There's no difference to her. So the whole plan just doesn't work at all. At the same time, Mombi has arrived at the Gnome King's mountain, says, "Dorothy's on her way." And he goes, "She's already here. Don't worry, I've got it taken care of." And Dorothy then uses up 2 of her guesses. So she has to use her final guess essentially by chance. She closes her eyes, she spins around, she holds out her arms, and she just walks toward something. And she ends up grabbing this emerald that is on a table. And she says Oz, and the emerald turns into the Scarecrow. And the Gnome King gets mad. Right after this shot, there is a zoom in of him with his pipe going, "Impossible," or something like that. He's not happy. So they realize that the green ornaments are what all of their friends have turned into. So they start going around and they start bringing back all their friends. They bring back Jack, they bring back the Gump, they bring back ultimately Bellina, who was inside Jack's head. The Gnome King just gets angrier and angrier, and he basically, here comes scary movie scene number 3. The ornament room starts to collapse. All these stone creatures start appearing in the walls and start chasing Dorothy and her friends around this cavern. And it finally gets to the point where the Gnome King takes his final form, just like this large stone mountain surrounded by fire, and he tries to eat them. He grabs the sofa that's attached to the Gump, and they hold on tight to the head, and the head ends up coming off, and he just eats the sofa. And then he tries to eat Jack. But Bellina is in Jack's head. He doesn't know there's a chicken. And as we know, the Gnome King is not fond of chickens. Bellina finally lays an egg, which she's been trying to do since she was in Kansas. And the egg rolls right out of Jack's head and into the Gnome King's mouth. He quickly announces before he starts to disintegrate that eggs are poison to gnomes, and I don't know where that idea. I know it's in the Baum book, but I just think that's so funny that of all things,
it's as if L. Frank Baum was telling his kids, and then his kids were like, "And then an egg was poison," and then he was like, "And then the egg was poison,"
and then
the end.
Or he's telling the story to the kids, and they're like, "But how did they defeat the Gnome King?" He goes, "I don't know." He goes in the kitchen and looks in the fridge and goes, "Egg."
Eggs are poison.
Eggs are poison. Eggs are poison to the gnomes. The Gnome King starts to disintegrate. The palace starts to collapse, essentially. Rocks and boulders are falling. But in the rubble, Dorothy finds her ruby slippers. She puts them back on, and she wishes that all of her friends are out of the Gnome Kingdom and back at the Emerald City. So that happens. They make the troubling discovery. They did not find tick-tock in the ornament room. They didn't have time to find him. And then I think Bellina notices that on the Gump's antler there's some green medallion that he didn't realize was there. And so she grabs the ornament, she says Oz, and tick-tock is restored.
And they all go to the Emerald City.
Yes, and they do. They all go to the Emerald City. But Dorothy also uses the ruby slippers to restore the Emerald City back to its former glory. All the emeralds are returned. All of the people in the Emerald City, they're no longer turned to stone. Their heads are returned. Mombi appears in a cage.
We said, let's lock her up.
They then have this huge procession. They go into Oz. The Wheelers have turned new leaf because they are no longer servants of Mombi. That's a common trope with the Winkies, especially in the first book, who are subservient to the Wicked Witch of the West. Once she's dead, they can live free and they can be happy and they can be good. And there's this huge parade that ultimately is supposed to lead to this coronation where they crown Dorothy as the Queen of Oz. And they ask her to stay there forever. And she says no, because she wants to go back home. Because she can't leave behind her aunt and her uncle and her dog. And she's talking about, I wish I could be in both places at the same time. I wish I could be here in Oz, and I wish I could be in Kansas because I love you all. And then this mysterious specter appears in the mirror.
It's Pumpkin Girl.
It's Pumpkin Girl, and she's in this beautiful green dress, and she has this tiara and a scepter. And it turns out that Mombi had been hiding her in the mirror so she could not reclaim her rightful throne, because she's supposed to be the Queen of Oz. But she's been long lost, this Princess Ozma. So Dorothy takes her out of the mirror. They like grab hands, and Ozma comes out, and it's explained Ozma's the daughter of the King of Oz that was ultimately dethroned by the wizard, enslaved by Mombi, and then Jack Pumpkinhead sees her and goes, "Mom!" Because this whole time he's been calling Dorothy Mom because he just has mommy issues.
Yeah.
Because his mom just disappeared. And now they're reunited, and Ozma says that she'll forgive Mombi for imprisoning her, but she's taken away her magic. Ozma's the one who gets the ruby slippers, and she decides to use slippers to tell Dorothy to go back to Kansas, and Ozma agrees to check in on her from time to time, and if she ever wants to come back to Oz, she'll just use ruby slippers and bring Dorothy back. And Dorothy is very happy with that. Bellina decides, I don't want to go back to Kansas. I don't want to lay eggs all my entire life. I want to live. So Bellina stays in Oz, and Ozma sends Dorothy back. Dorothy wakes up covered in mud in the woods, and it's Toto who finds her. Toto is the one who discovers her. And then Henry and Em follow Toto's barking, and they find her. And then it's explained that the hospital was struck by lightning in the storm. It burned to the ground, and almost everyone was rescued except for Dr. Worley because he ran back in to save his machines.
And then who passes by in a jail cart?
The nurse, who is also portrayed by the same actress who plays Mombi.
So fun parallel there.
Yeah, I love that scene. It's also very ominous. It feels like if there were to be a sequel to this movie, it feels like Mombi is like
The Revenge of Nurse Wilson.
The Revenge of Nurse Wilson. Return to Oz 2.
Yeah.
Return to Oz again.
We are back.
Here we go again.
Yes.
Return to Oz 2. Here we go again. This mysterious girl, of course, Pumpkin Girl, is not found, except now we know that Pumpkin Girl is essentially Ozma, and Dorothy finally has her own bedroom because it's months or so later and the farmhouse has finally been finished. And while she's in the house, Ozma appears in her bedroom mirror holding Bellina, and Dorothy calls to Aunt Em because she's going to try and prove to Aunt Em that Oz is real. Take a look. But then Ozma, she holds her finger to her mouth and is like, shh. And so Dorothy then just flips the mirror over and says, oh, nothing, it was just my reflection. And she goes out into the yard and plays with Toto. Credits roll.
The end.
The end. It's such a good movie.
It's so fun.
It's such a good movie. Let's talk about the source material. This movie, I find, is full of Easter eggs for the OzBook fans. I mean, the character designs are faithful to the original illustrations by John R. Neal. In the coronation scene, there's so many blink and you'll miss it cameos of OzBook characters. You have characters that are as prominent as Glinda or the Patchwork Girl or the Shaggy Man, but also you have the Braided Man and Captain Bill and the Frog Man, some Tommy Quickstep, characters that only appear like once in the series, but they're there. And it's so cool to see them envisioned in live action. And even though they're just sort of in the back, it also makes you think about these costumes. Some of them are very elaborate for roles who are only extras, essentially.
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine making the Frogman costume for a background role?
Truly like 3 seconds of footage in the entire movie, you know?
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah. And that, I guess, goes to show how much they cared about every detail. You know, they wanted it to be immersive and true to the story.
You can tell this movie was made with great care for the source material. And although there are original elements to this movie, it still is deeply rooted in the original Baum mythos. Also, another Easter egg, I didn't notice this until recently, actually until someone on Reddit pointed this out to me. When the Emerald City is restored, there's a brief shot of a woman on a bench, and she's actually reading The Marvelous Land of Oz. The book is open to a chapter when they meet the Sawhorse.
I have to go back to, because I have not seen that.
I mean, like you said, you saw it for the first time this year.
I mean, true.
But to be fair, I also didn't catch it until someone pointed it out to me online. So this book ultimately follows the plot of Ozma of Oz. almost completely.
Yeah.
But it just adds in some major elements from the second book, like combining the witch Mombi in book 2 and Princess Langwidere in book 3, because in the original book, Mombi does not have interchangeable heads. Princess Langwidere does, and they are combined to make this more sinister character and also a cohort of the Gnome King.
Which I think this is a good example of adaptation because I think it streamlines this kind of, like, I think the combination of Princess Langwidere and Mombi together, I think makes a really strong villain character, you know.
Absolutely. She's also so scary in this movie. I think those characters work really well together. And especially because in book 3, Princess Langwidere doesn't have much. She captures Dorothy when she immediately finds her because she wants her head, and then once like Ozma appears and is like, no, you can't have her, she's like, fine. She's just kind of a spoiled brat.
Isn't she only in that one scene that like
Yeah.
like her intro scene, and then that's it, you know?
Yeah, that's really it.
Yeah.
So I honestly like this combination.
Yeah.
Book 3 does feature Ozma heavily, but this movie sort of takes the book 2 route of having Ozma be hidden until the very end. And so, but of course in the books, Ozma is transformed into a boy named Tip, and Tip has no memory of his past life. And then we go through the entire book with Tip, only to find out that he's not actually Tip, he's Princess Ozma.
Which is cute when Jack Pumpkinhead is like, Mom, because like Tipitarius, you know, and that whole backstory is, you know,
Yeah.
with Jack.
It makes me wonder if, like, in this universe, if Ozma was ever Tip. Probably not, but I just think that's really cute.
Yeah.
Another detail, the Gnome King is confronted here, but instead of Ozma and her army of 27, it's Dorothy, Bellina, tick-tock, Jack, and the Gump. Jack and the Gump are not in book 3. They do not appear with the team that conquers the Gnome King. And this is also where we know that the army was going to be in this movie, but then the budget was restricted and they were cut. Also, the royal family of Ev subplot is dropped.
Yeah, I don't know. I just think that like the land of because the Gnome King's like world is kind of like condensed. We don't really learn as much about Ev. And when I remember reading the book, I was like, this is kind of interesting. And I think that the way that this adaptation, the movie screenplay streamlines the whole thing, I think it works because in the book we can learn a little bit more about it, but we don't have as much time like in the film.
Right, and almost all of the book takes place in Ev. Like when Dorothy originally arrives, she washes ashore
In Ev. Yeah.
She's not. That's where the Wheelers are. That's where the lunch pail trees are. That's where the Gnome King is. That's where Langwidere is. And so here, all of that is presumably in Oz. Because they don't mention another country. Yes, they cross the Deadly Desert, and in the books, if you cross the desert, you go to a different country. But here, that's not mentioned. More original elements of this movie include the ruins of Oz, especially the Emerald City. Yes, taking Dorothy to shock therapy replaces the book's method of Dorothy just getting lost at sea, which also sounds, out of context, that also sounds pretty dark.
Well,
but
it's so funny. Uncle Henry, they're like, we're going to Australia to visit my cousin or something. And then I'm like,
yeah,
what?
They're going to visit relatives in Australia.
Yeah, and then they get like a storm washes up on. It's crazy.
Yeah. I don't really understand that either.
I just kind of giggle.
And then book 4 picks up immediately where book 3 leaves off, because book 3 is like ends with Dorothy and Uncle Henry in Australia, and then book 4 starts with her getting home. She just left Australia and now she's in California and she's trying to get back to Kansas.
World traveler.
But really, other than those new elements, I'm sure I'm missing some. Please let me know if I'm missing anything big.
I mean, I think those are the big ones for me that we kind of like snipped from both of these stories to then like push it together.
Right. I think overall this is such an excellent adaptation. It's the only one I've seen thus far that maintains the spirit of Baum's books. The characters look so close to the original books. It also corrects that element that was introduced in the 1939 movie that Oz is a dream place, but here Oz is real. We know that as a fact because when Ozma appears in the mirror, that's sort of the reveal that no, Dorothy wasn't dreaming this time.
Yeah.
This absolutely was real.
Yeah.
And I love that about this movie.
Me too. Yeah.
I love this movie so much.
Yeah, I think it's so fun. I had not been exposed to the books up until about a year ago, and so now that I've like binged them all and been able to like see how true that this adaptation is, it's like made me appreciate it the more, because I'm like, oh yes, that's exactly right, or oh, that's
Yeah.
in reference to that, you know.
Yeah, it just feels so careful and so accurate. I love the MGM movie. It's one of my favorite movies of all time.
Hmm.
And in the previous episode, I do mention that the MGM movie is ultimately the quintessential Oz adaptation. But in terms of the books and adapting the books, this is the best one. This
Definitely.
is at least the one that I've seen so far. I'm going to cover a lot more this season, but now that I've finally read all the books and also like catching elements that very, very minor things that are mentioned in like later books that aren't necessarily in books 2 or 3, like the whole Army of Oz badge on tick-tock doesn't even appear until the 8th book, where he becomes a member of the Royal Army of Oz. So it's just so nice to have those little Easter eggs that you can pick up on. And I have such a new appreciation for it now that I've actually read the books.
Hmm. Yeah, it's like so apparent to me that like Merch is like a fan, you know, like is a fan of like
Yes.
the source material, you know.
Yeah,
It's like
through
ah.
and through. So let's talk about the reception of this movie. I know, I know.
And
S-
I get it in a way, you know, people were expecting something a little different.
Many people have said that the MGM movie sort of ruined Oz adaptations for the future because everyone has to sort of take that into consideration now.
Hmm.
And this one does includes Ruby Slippers, and so there's at least that string that connects it. But this movie is obviously separate. So the movie premiered in theaters on June 21st, 1985, and the film was sort of mismarketed. Audiences were just expecting a sequel to the MGM musical, even though it was already stated in previous interviews that it was going to be based in the books. It got mixed reviews. There were so many critics that believed it was way too dark for children, which I don't necessarily disagree.
I know, because it
uh,
is a dark film.
when I showed it to my parents, I was like, I was loving it. I was going for it. And they were like, this is scary. This is really creepy. And me like sitting on the floor watching the movie, turning around to see what their faces are, and they're just like, uh okay. It definitely wasn't what people were expecting. The movie ultimately did lose money. It only grossed over $11 million in North America. Keep in mind it had a $28 million budget by the end of the film. But it was nominated for an Academy Award.
Hmm.
It received a nod for Best Visual Effects. And aside from all of the things on screen, one of my favorite things about this movie is the score.
It is
The
so
score
good.
the score by David Shire. Stream it on Spotify like right now if you haven't already. It's just gorgeous. Sometimes I listen to it when I'm working on my podcast. It helps me stay motivated to stay in like this Oz mindset. It's probably one of my favorite scores of all time.
It's so good. It's so emotional. It has those melodic motifs of like Ozma has her like, you know, melody. Dorothy has her melody, and then like really just enhances the drama
It does.
without it being like in your face. It
Yeah.
like walks the line so beautifully.
There's like big brass when Headless Mombi wakes up,
Hmm.
and there's a bunch of musical stings in there. It's genuinely, that also makes the scene all the scarier.
Hmm. And when they're
It's
like going off the balcony and they're flying, that bum bum bum, you just like
yeah,
know. So
it's
iconic.
so good.
Yeah.
It's so good. It did have mixed reviews, but over the years, as it's become more available in home media, it's garnered this cult classic status. Many people really latch on to the dark nature of it. Many fans of the books praise this movie for being so accurate and so close to the original. I'm glad that people have given some love and respect to this movie. I don't think it got a fair shot when it was released.
Hmm.
So I'm glad that people have rediscovered it now. Tim Burton has also mentioned that when he was doing Nightmare Before Christmas, when he was designing Jack Skellington, he was very inspired by Jack Pumpkinhead in this movie.
Oh, cool.
So there's also a connection to that. Like, it definitely had at least some influence in movies, and people end up using this aesthetic for something else. And Nightmare Before Christmas is one of the biggest Christmas/Halloween movies that exists. It's so well beloved. So I am so happy that it has finally, at least now, gotten the recognition that it deserves, because it is a really, really well done movie.
Yeah, it is really cool. I think being an Oz fan, I can appreciate all of the callbacks and
Yeah.
artistry of filmmaking
Yeah.
that was
It's
done at
beautifully
this
shot.
time. It's like wild.
It's beautifully shot, and just the combination of all the different special effects, I think they're done so effectively,
Mhm.
and it really sells the movie. Of course, like I mentioned earlier, it has become more endearing as effects continue to progress, but I think it still feels magical to me.
Yeah.
Well, that's Return to Oz.
I am so glad that I finally saw it, having not
Mhm.
seen it for so long, and it's another great Oz adaptation that is to be celebrated.
I certainly recommend it to any Oz fan or anyone who's listening who hasn't seen it. Even if you're not an Oz fan, it's a really, really cool movie.
Mhm.
So, Christopher, where can people find you?
Well, you can find me on Instagram, Oz Book Collector, and I'm a part of the International Wizard of Oz Club. So if you haven't joined,
I am also a member of the Oz Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the Oz Club, sometimes they do some virtual programming, including a talk show called Oz Talk, which is hosted by Garrett Kilgore, Ryan J, and Tori Calamito. If you're familiar with her work on TikTok, she is the Oz vlogger. The show is a lot of fun. They always have some really cool guests, including Christopher here. He actually was on an episode a couple months ago, right?
yeah, that's
Yeah,
easy.
very recently. Give Christopher a follow. Go ahead and check a look at the International Wizard of Oz Club. We would love to have you be a member with the both of us.
Yeah,
And I think that's all we have for today.
yeah. Thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.